Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis, and for tonight's show we've got two guests. We've got Alan Flowers, the activist and scientist. Hey Alan. And we've also got the former
Good
SNP
evening,
MP for...
Edinburgh.
Oh sorry, there's a bit of a lag. Well, and we also have the former SNP Member of Parliament for Gordon, Richard Thomson. Hey Richard.
Good evening.
We're going to do tonight's show a bit differently because of the breaking news in Ukraine, so we'll mostly focus on that, but first we'll start with an overview of the headlines of basically all the rest of the news today. In a local radio interview, Nicola Sturgeon has said she is 100% certain that Scotland will become independent in her lifetime. The United Kingdom's economy has flatlined as GDP growth has hit just 0.1% in the final quarter of 2024. UK firms concerned about fallout from knock-on effect of Trump's global trade war. The Resolution Foundation study finds solar panels could cut fuel poor UK families' energy bills by nearly a quarter. Iranian state media says two UK nationals have been arrested in Iran on security allegations. Belarus released 3 detainees, including a veteran journalist for a US government-funded Radio Liberty and a US citizen. Researchers at the University of Glasgow have found that adults, so aged 25 to 34, with learning disabilities are 9 times more likely to die from treatable causes compared to young adults in the general population. Also, the Nursing and Midwife Task Force, established by the Scottish Government in 2023, has just published its recommendations today. And the University of Strathclyde Research finds RSV vaccine results in reduction in hospitalizations. Sorry. So just start with you, Alan. What do you make? Or did anything stand out from the headlines?
Well, very pleasing to hear of the Anglo-Belarusian Society in the UK. I should point out I am speaking, of course, in an independent, personal, private capacity. But of course, it is good news that we've had further political prisoner releases from Belarus. That is very, very important as part of a trend that is taking place. And rather interesting that Mr. Lukashenko, by the way, he again selected him in a thoroughly undemocratic election on the 26th of January, that Mr. Lukashenko he needs to curry favor with Mr. Trump. Now, quite why that should be when his bosom buddy, the co-aggressor of Ukraine with Mr. Putin, is unclear. But these little news snippets can't count them seeds of something might be of far greater weight. And I've known this leader and of his antics for all 30 years he's been in power, but he is a master at positioning himself to adeptly jump from one ally to another. So we watch this space quite clearly. Preparations for any peace negotiations well in play, and this game with Mr. Lukashenko that we've seen in recent days, and America clearly had an interest to get their prisoner out. It's quite clear Mr. Putin would be calling the shots. How much icing Mr. Lukashenko did on the cake with the Belarusian releases is not clear. All part of a very complex tripartite Trump, Putin, Lukashenko deal, more about which we might be talking later.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, yeah. What about you, Richard? Did anything stand out to you from those headlines?
No, not especially. I'm just very interested in what Alan has had to say, and as you say, I hope we get into some of that further as the program progresses.
Yeah, no, we'll get that. That'll be the main body of the program. But just before we move on to discussing Ukraine and the recent update, we'll first quickly cover the Middle East situation. At least 48,000 Palestinians have been killed and 111,500 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October 2025, according to the Gaza Health Authority. Arab mediators have been scrambling to save the Gaza ceasefire as the Israeli military bolsters troop and tank deployments to the Strip's periphery in advance of the possibility the truce breaks down this weekend. Hamas has said it would release the next group of Israeli hostages as planned, paving the way towards resolving a major dispute that threatened the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. According to reports, Hamas said Egyptian and Qatari mediators have affirmed that they will work to, quote, remove all hurdles and that it would implement the truce deal. The Israeli government has signaled that it intends to stick to the hostage release schedule agreed in the initial ceasefire deal with Hamas, but warned that if the anticipated free hostages are not released on Saturday, it would go back to war. Israel's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Jordan's King Abdullah both said on Wednesday Gaza should be rebuilt without displacing any Palestinians, according to a readout of a call between the two leaders by the Egyptian presidency. The United States has authorized a, quote, long-term Israeli troop presence in southern Lebanon, according to Israeli reports, while Israel is to keep its troops in multiple posts in southern Lebanon until the 28th of February. Israel had previously agreed to remove the troops before the end of January. Israeli settlers are pushing ahead with a largely unnoticed de facto annexation of large areas of rural land in the occupied West Bank that have already seen the almost total displacement of Benedum in large areas. There are fears that the settlers' attacks have the aim of fragmenting the territory for a future Palestinian state. Also, the Danish government said today that it was pledging an additional 1.4 million euros to the UN's Palestine Refugee Agency, UNRWA, which has been banned from operating in the state of Israel. Although more than 350 rabbis, alongside additional signatories, including Jewish creatives and activists, have signed an ad in the New York Times in which they condemn Donald Trump's proposal for the effective ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. So I'll just start with you, Richard. What do you think the future of this ceasefire will be? Do you think it's going to hold?
No, frankly. Unless there's some rapid shift in position, I think there's a deadline on Saturday, and as I've said many times on this programme in relation to the current appalling situation in the Middle East, Israel fears no consequences, and they feared no consequences for their actions under President Biden after the encouragement that Netanyahu had in the White House this past week. I don't think they certainly will not fear any consequences of what they do subsequently. So, unless there's a sudden meeting of minds over how to make sure that each side's conditions that they signed up to the ceasefire are met to their satisfaction in a way that can be found to save face, I think that we've sadly seen the end of this brief ceasefire.
What are your thoughts on that, Alan?
Oh gosh, I'm always described as the eternal optimist. I mean, anybody who's been looking for democracy for 30 years has got a of an eternal optimist. I'm just wondering, though, if the political realities aren't beginning to shift for Mr. Netanyahu. Incident of the release of the associated hostage was somewhat shattering and did produce major further strong protests in Israel. One really wonders where the interests lie. I mean, clearly Hamas is trying to play this long, but now the hope that there are adequate releases. And we were following very carefully the semantics of what was coming from Netanyahu, whereas Trump was trying to bully into an all hostage release. Netanyahu never mentioned that phrase, never added the all. He was looking for hostages release, which can be taken to be what was originally agreed. So if that, there's a bit more legging to go, and there's the issue of getting the phase 2 negotiations going. So let's try and live in hope that the interests of all parties are to cool this. I find it hurts that Israel's that they're somehow going to change minds by bombing rubble. Now, the point is, not all of Gaza is rubble yet. There are very livable areas, a substantial population, well, in excess of 1 million still. But this is destruction on top of destruction, and one really wonders if the overall on balance is really people are going to be satisfied, if particularly if they lose the limited number of hostages as a result of this. So my take is let's try and be optimistic and hope that some sane minds will operate process.
Oh, I feel like that's an interesting point you make, because you're right. I think in the context of Donald Trump's statements, a lot of people have seen the deal a lot more pessimistically, but I think you're right to bring up the fact that the conditions in the ground now are so quite similar to what they were before in terms of, the domestic pressure on Netanyahu and, the Palestinians sort of like not giving in to the bombardment. So, that's a good point, I think, yeah. Looking at the time, and given the majority of the show is going to be focused on Ukraine, I'll now move to the Ukraine update on day 1086 of the conflict, and then we can move on to a broader discussion. As ministers from France, the UK, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, and the European Union's Commission met with Ukraine's Foreign Minister in Paris on Wednesday, the US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, said a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders was unrealistic, and the US did not see NATO membership for Kiev as part of a solution to the war. Hegseth's comments were followed by a call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, after which Trump said their teams had agreed to start negotiations immediately, and he would meet the Russian president in Saudi Arabia. The US president underlined he was, quote, okay with Ukraine being barred from NATO and cared little if Russia kept the land which it had invaded. When asked if any European countries would be involved in peace talks, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said, quote, I don't have any European nations who are involved currently to read out for you. On Wednesday, European ministers said nothing about ending Russia's war against Ukraine should be decided without the Ukrainians. A joint statement of several countries and the European Commission said Ukraine and Europe must be part of any negotiations. Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine would need the US to help build up an army as big as that of Russia as a, quote, plan B if it wasn't able to join NATO. Quote, if Ukraine is not in NATO, it means Ukraine will build NATO on its territory, Zelensky said in an interview with The Economist published on Wednesday. Ukraine said it had detained a high-ranking official within its security services who was allegedly working for the Russian government. 8 men went on trial in Russia on Wednesday, charged with, quote, a terrorist act over the deadly explosion that tore through the illegal Kerch Bridge built by Russia from its territory to Crimea. Ukraine will help from partners to import additional gas amid constant Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian gas facilities, Deputy Energy Minister Roman Adansk said on Wednesday. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said on Wednesday that a critical minerals deal between Kiev and Washington could leave Ukraine with a, quote, security shield once the war was over with Russia. After meeting Bessent in Kiev, Zelensky said Ukraine and the US were drawing up a, quote, new document on security, economic cooperation and resource partnership, and he hoped to sign an agreement at the Munich Security Conference on Friday. The UK said on Wednesday it would give Ukraine military aid worth £150 million, including drones, tanks and air defense systems. China is helping Russia's military drone production by becoming a hub for the smuggling of critical Western components for Moscow's armed forces, Estonian Foreign Intelligence Agency in its annual national security report published on Wednesday. About 80% of such components reaching Russia now come from China, the report said. The previous Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, has accused President Zelensky of having Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, quote, adopt unconstitutional policies which are politically motivated, including sanctions against him. Poroshenko had the opposition bloc's largest party in Ukrainian parliament at the moment. So we'll get into the wider implications of all this throughout the show, but first let's just focus on Trump and Putin's call itself. So just start with you, Richard. Like, what do you think? What are your initial thoughts on the phone call?
Not good, I'm afraid. I think it was a poor showing that Trump has spoken to Putin in this context before he's spoken to Zelensky or his allies. I see a rather salty tweet from former NATO General Secretary Carl Bildt earlier today about the fact that even in 1938, there were negotiations before things were given away. I'm not sure, in spite of all the rhetoric that's come out of the House of Commons today about betrayals and everything like that, as MPs preen themselves up, that it's necessarily useful to talk that way before we see the detail. But the initial signs aren't good. But I think that there's a few things that we need to take from this. I think, yes, it probably is unrealistic that Ukraine will get all of the territory that's been taken by Russia since 2014 back. And I think that there are best case and worst case scenarios out of what might come out of these talks when they happen. I think the best case is that there is some return of Ukrainian territory, that there is some security guarantees short of NATO membership, that there is a defensive rearmament, and that there's reconstruction and reparation, and that the Ukrainians are involved. The worst case is that there's no return of any territory, that there's no involvement or meaningful involvement in talks, that no guarantees are offered, there's no reconstruction and no reparation. And the worry that has to be at the back of this is that the US is not going to be able to be relied upon as a reliable partner in future. But one thing I think that we do, the message that's come out from this from the White House that is crystal clear, is that Europe is going to have to take on a greater responsibility for not just for its own defence, but also for the upholding the remaining territorial integrity of Ukraine. And that's something that has come through in a Trump was consistent about. He's not consistent about many things, but he was consistent about that during his first term. And I think that we're being delivered a very stark message that the days of being able to rely on the US as the guarantors of Western Europe's security are over, and that we're going to have to be spending more than we are currently, individually and collectively, in order to secure the future defence of ourselves and of the rest of Europe. But, I have to say I'm not optimistic about the way this has started off, about the way that Trump seems to be, as he might see it, cutting to the chase. I think it's sending out a series of unfortunate messages, but we've yet to see where this goes. But as I say, this is not the conventional way of doing diplomacy, and I am not particularly optimistic at this stage.
You think that the Americans' initial negotiating positions were too weak? Because that's been a criticism made, I guess, by various European leaders. And if so, in what way?
Yes, I do think they were weak. I think Putin is a style of negotiator that if you offer him anything, he will say thank you very much and bank it without offering anything in return. So you have to play a very, very careful negotiation. You also have to, we're also putting a certain amount of faith that whatever might eventually be agreed with Putin is something that he or any successors then adhere to, because the danger, again, would be that something does get agreed and then it's simply viewed as the staging post for further salami slicing in future, or a reason is found for him to claim that the terms of an agreement have in some way broken down, and that therefore invalidates it, and then to start off from the point that he'd effectively banked his progress as he would see it. So I think that this is not the conventional way of doing diplomacy, and while I think that bringing the conflict to a halt would be a good thing as long as it did not regularise in any legal sense the stealing of Ukrainian territory by the Russian state. This is not the way that it should be gone about. I think it will be far more encouraging for the Kremlin than it is for anyone who still clings to the hope that there might be a rules-based international order out there worth upholding.
Yeah, well, we will be talking a bit further about like the international order and what the impact of this will be on like international norms and whatnot at the end of the show. But before we move on, what are your thoughts, like initial thoughts, Alan, on this phone call and negotiations starting, after 3 years of war?
Well, my thoughts are twofold. One, emphasis on this phone call, but what about a little bit more strength? Yeah, lost population in the United States of America, and also at least as much, if not more, economic. I mean, it's an issue about the way we manage our defense, and we can come to that.
Yeah.
The State Department officials, I mean, there's obviously what's in Trump's own head and his sort of feel for how he should handle this. But the position of the United States State Department in the last decade over Ukraine, but in its whole attitude to the way the European people conduct itself, been proven time and time again to be absolutely misjudged. And I don't give a halfpen's worth of that statement about to get Crimea back is unrealistic. I'm about Ambassador Joe Kennedy, the father of President John Kennedy, agreeing that Britain had about 10 weeks left in 1940 and better all give up and get out. I'm also remembering about the position the State Department of America over the invasion of Russia to February 2022, where they were all for saying, right, let's move into evacuation mode. We'll offer the president a way out. It was better than that. Brits had been the Ukrainians quite, not even subtly, we'd actually made it very evident there were all the flight transports. And we piled up with not all that expensive weapons to defend a tank invasion, and not to mention that there were other subtle partisan tricks that managed to halt the convoy. There's all sorts of win a battle that I think are actually beyond the concept, and they still are. It's very disappointing. Europeans, I believe they have learned, because it's often being referenced this comparison to 1938 and Munich. If Presensky is not to order his army to stop fighting, who's going to force them to do it? It's not going to be the Ukrainian people, because you see, I'm wearing a Ukrainian tie to go to Lviv in about another 2 weeks. I will be there. And those of us who are close with Ukrainians know that the summon nothing but anger and disgust at this phone call, and huge support and appreciation for the voices coming from not only the NATO countries, but many, many other supportive Western, the fifth at what was a UK-led Ukraine. You have to remember, we took over when the Americans decided wouldn't hold it was meant to take place at one of the European air bases. I just wonder if Trump, who seems to want to be the president of the leading nation of the world, isn't eventually to realize that by emptying chairs, will step in. And maybe it's going to be a matter of time before he realizes that vacate spaces at the top table for the UK and other countries was maybe not such a good idea. you'll also eventually waken up to the fact that there's lots of real estate in Ukraine, investments, and Europe and Britain are right in the fore there, ready to take off and already planning for a post-war economic boom in Ukraine. Maybe I shouldn't say really. One of Mr. Trump's advisors might tell him, "Hey, President, you're missing an opportunity by not supporting Ukraine."
Well,
Get
yeah,
that
no,
one a bit.
actually, I did read that part of negotiations with Ukraine and America about the ceasefire was that America was going to sort of give security guarantees for economic cooperation. So yeah, that could be happening. I guess I can definitely see that being in America's interest
Yep.
to have economic interests within Ukraine. But we've touched on it quite a bit, but so I'll just go directly to it, and I'll just start with you, Richard, in terms of Europe. So in this sort of context, the U.S. Defense Secretary has said that Europe will no longer be the primary focus of American foreign policy, and that seems maybe to be demonstrated first and foremost by what this call and his want for negotiations and to sort of end the war in Ukraine, I guess, or at least withdraw American support from Ukraine. So, like, what do you make of the sort of new global arrangement that's developing? And do you think America withdrawing from Europe will be like a good or a bad thing for Europe?
I'll start off by saying it's not a good thing for Europe, and it's not a good thing for America. Look, I'm no apologist for the United States or many of the foreign policies it's pursued over the last half century or more. But nevertheless, there have been two times in the last century or more where the United States has tried to stand aloof from political upheaval in Europe and has found itself having to send its young men and women across to uphold the values of freedom and democracy. And, God forbid that they should ever have to do so again. But the security of America is bound up in the security of Western Europe and vice versa. And any attempt to retreat from that, I think, shows a lack of historical awareness and a lack of awareness of the forces which work in the world. The very fact that the United States sees Russia or China as an adversary, whether that's just simply an economic adversary, but also as a military adversary, then you have to take seriously the strategic significance of Europe. Particularly, let's just look at where we are in Scotland. We're at the crossroads of trade between Europe and North America, but we're also at the southern end of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. Now, we haven't heard a great deal about that since the end of the Cold War, but I think we're about to start hearing a great deal more about it, because that gap in the sea lanes between Greenland, which has obviously been in the news quite a bit of late, Iceland and the UK, that's the route by which Soviet nuclear armed submarines would take from Murmansk to get into the North Atlantic and be able to potentially target their weapons at the United States. So, if the United States is forgetting about the importance of that to its security, then, God help them, frankly. Also, there's the US, its ballistic, despite the advances in satellite technology, it still relies heavily on the radar arrays at Thule in Greenland and also at Fylingdales in Yorkshire in terms of giving early warning of any ballistic missile attack from the direction of Russia. So, certainly the US has a massive strategic interest still, whether it recognises it or not just in peace and prosperity and having stable partners in Europe, but also for defending itself and having that security and peace of mind back at home. But, the greatest threat to Pax Americana, if you like, is a retreat in the values of free markets and liberal democracy. And if Europe can no longer is coming under great pressure from states that are not willing to uphold these values and those basic values that we would hold in the West, then that ultimately threatens American preeminence as well. Now, I'm aware there's quite a lot in that. It won't necessarily endear me to all of my political friends out there, but whatever differences we have in approach, whatever differences we have from time to time in outlook, there is far more that overlaps in terms of our commitment to personal freedom and democracy and liberty. And if America is retreating from from seeing Europe as being part of the front line on that, I think it's taking the wrong lessons, not just from history as a whole, but also from recent history, even post-Cold War.
Although, do you think that all of America's, I guess, actions in Europe are benevolent? Because, like, obviously America is a nation state with its own interests, and especially in light of more protectionist policies, it seems to be having gone to a more, I guess, America first sort of ideology. Like, is it potentially naive for European nations to just keep trying to, effectively, as you described it, was the geopolitical sort of teams, if you know what I mean, to put it in that sense, with Russia and America? Is it maybe naive for Europe to continuously try to align with America, even if America turned this back on Europe in some ways?
It's not naive to think that both Europe and America are stronger when they cooperate. But like I said at the top of the programme, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult even just a few weeks into this Trump presidency to see the US as a reliable security partner anymore. Certainly with the unilateral imposition of tariffs. I mean, trade tariffs, there can be good reasons for them, but if there are reciprocal tariffs and trade wars, and everybody gets poorer, is the lesson from history. So I think it's, Europe has to stand up for its own interests. It has to take a greater interest in its own interests. It has to do more for itself. But are we weakened when Europe and the US are not broadly in alignment, despite other disagreements that we might have from time to time? I would contest in the broad sweep of history, yes, that is the case. And the days of being able to simply, we've almost lived a charmed existence in Europe and for many decades now. I think we have to be more realistic as to our place in the world, what we do to defend those things that we hold dear in terms of the way that we wish to order our societies. But would we be stronger if we had somebody different in the White House who appreciated that mutual benefit that there is from that? Of course we would.
So just I'll go to you, Alan, and I want to ask you about the Munich Security Conference, or something said there. So what do you make of the American Defense Secretary's demand for NATO countries, like the UK, to significantly increase defense spending?
Well, you're right to mention, and I agree with everything that's just been said, and particularly as the son of a merchant navy mariner that crossed the Atlantic and knew all about the Iceland and Greenland Straits and the Murmansk convoys. I grew up as well through that period. I'm aware of significant defence role that Britain still holds, for that matter, and certainly did then, in terms of waters that the United States has a huge interest in. And I was very keen at NATO, the Ukraine conference, that Britain was saying a very senior armed naval officer, an admiral, I can't recollect his name, and I thought that was a wonderful visual statement, without anything having to be said, of the continuing and long-term role Britain has specifically taken, and not to mention all us that the waters all along our coastline, the North Scapa Flow, and all that. So history, I should say, absolutely right, has already been. I hugely agree with bringing these out. But in terms of the statements we've had, I almost begin to feel we're living in two very universes. There is the American dream fantasy of how this will end, and whether you the European one, those meeting at the conferences, both for Ukraine and the NATO conference today, fantasy, Absolutely, clearly, very different beliefs and visions. The very fact that the armaments are running in a pipeline intended to Ukraine and in a position of stress ring is complementary to Trump. I mean, it's almost like Trump wants to get in there quick, and so does Putin. I mean, whether Putin and Trump or Trump's playing a very useful distraction sideshow wouldn't know what the overall Western game might be here, but he's doing a very good job of that. We're getting a story that's getting people all very negative about Ukraine, the same as sending meaningful forces and investment in support of the war for Ukraine are going in. So, I mean, to cut short what could be a long your question, what I think of the current in place is there's quite obviously two very parallel dialogues going on. You just need to listen to the speech of our John Healey and then compare that with a speech of the Secretary for America, completely at odds, and so obviously so. I'm sure we will keep pressing on, as we have so often done, along with the Ukrainians, as Ukraine wants that, and I'm very heartened by the decision of Europe, Britain, the countries in and around Europe, with Ukraine, basically saying Ukraine part of the negotiations is essential, and we will keep on supporting Ukraine as long as they're the support. It's a very, very different. Heartened by that, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more months. My travel to Ukraine is about delivering a vehicle, an evacuation vehicle, under the Driving Ukraine. And only any of your viewers can just driving Ukraine. If you put these two words in a search engine, you'll find the organization that's delivered nearly 170 vehicles going strong, because this is going on for some time. There's firm belief right across Europe, in Ukraine, all the people I'm speaking to, let Trump have his dialogue and get his sites and all that. But lots of mirrors are put on Trump, and it could prove to be a useful distractor, while those who are remaining steadfast friends supporting Ukraine's security and aiming for their territory, we just we'll keep marching.
Are you finished? You're cutting out a bit. I'm not sure if I lost you.
No, I'm finished. We keep marching on. That's my peril.
There's a lot of crackling. Your voice is okay. I was just checking there. Yeah. But just like sticking with Europe, several European leaders have committed in light of the phone call to increase military support for Ukraine. So the question is, what do you think Europe's role should then be in terms of these negotiations? Do you think Europe do you think Europe should support a sort of Trump-led negotiations in order to bring an end to the conflict, or do you think Europe should continue to give weapons to Ukraine and resist negotiations?
Yep, I'd like to come in on this because I've been making a very important point here in the UK government. Any such negotiations could take. And we've started off a little bit making comments about Belarus, but we have to ensure that countries impacted and affected by security are all there and around the table. However, there should be no truck given to a not legitimately elected Lukashenko, who is busy oscillating favor variously with Mr. and now trying to soften his position. We have to remember he hosted these failed Minsk talks after 2014, when the first incursion into Ukraine, an obvious effort with this 2015 election to curry favour with the West. So we have to be very careful. There's one pivotal country, very important position, a small 9 million population. However, the free Belarus people and the Belarus people who have their comrades, Belarusians, fighting in Ukraine with Ukrainians, which may not be widely known, albeit only a few thousand or so, the people who act as partisans, like the Russian invasion, need a voice. And therefore, I've been putting out an appeal that there needs to be an advocate for the Belarus at the negotiating table. Now, it's easy, the fact that there'll be major players, France, Germany, the UK, they're established states, their mission in this, in reaching a settlement that will hold. And there's all the issue about who's going to give real security guarantees, not something that was hollow, like written into the memorandum about the nuclear weapons. Not just a we'll refer the problem to the United Nations sort of absolutely meaningless hollow, but there's got to be something rather close to the NATO plan that force will be met by force. Now, we've already played this hearing in, and of course, Estonia is a NATO ally, but one of the 2014, Britain was in there with the British acting as a wire because Putin having Ukraine in 2014 was going to at the Baltics, and well, he didn't. Some people might remember one of Boris Johnson's more famous visits there, doing a Margaret Thatcher with a tank, sitting on top of a tank, talking to the British soldiers there. So we're going to be clearly Britain and major European countries involved in providing some kind of a defence guarantee. We need to be there. We will be there round a table at a time when the Ukrainians, and I echo John Healy's firm, clear statement, only when Ukraine is in a position of strength. The current and all the rhetoric that is coming from European countries, Britain included, is about do not go to the negotiating table in a position of weakness, some form of spring enforcements and of offence. That may well be the moment. It's a long time ago, 1918, but fronts moved forwards and gave a lot of sense, and eventually there was a negotiation from allied French and British strength. We can see the signs that all the strategy is get a situation where Ukraine is in this position of strength, and then somewhere at the spring, that's some negotiations, and obviously European countries will have to be ready as to what security guarantee would happen, both in terms of probably some form of neutrality for Ukraine.
Yeah.
But Ukraine, clearly, they're going to give up something. It's likely something may have to be paid off. They either win the territory pretty quickly or negotiation. We don't know, and it's not for us to decide. Okay.
So, Richard, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything that Alan said there. What can the Europeans do? What's their role? Well, I'm sure that Europe will be anxious to play a role, but whether or not they get a look in as Trump is determined to position himself as doing a deal remains to be seen. But in terms of what Europe should do, it should keep on doing what it's doing, because nothing changes until it changes. So arming Ukraine to give it the ability to defend itself, I think is vital. I think we need to look at strengthening, in a way that we haven't done so far, the ability of the Ukrainians to defend themselves from air attacks, because until there is a ceasefire or a peace, in inverted commas, settlement reached, you can bet your bottom dollar that the Russians will continue to try and exert military leverage in any way that they possibly can, and it is vital that Ukraine has all the agency that we can possibly give it, no matter what Trump might do to weaken that Ukrainians have as much agency as possible and as much strength as possible at the negotiation table. But I think that the one thing that Europe has to do above all, we've seen this irredentism going on from Russia. We've heard worrying statements from Trump about his own aspirations to control the Panama Canal and Greenland and, whether jokingly or not, Canada, to become the 51st state. He's sending out all the wrong messages. And I know he's a man who likes to seed confusion and chaos and then see what he can grab out of that. But, this is why it does not fill me with a great deal of confidence that this is the man who is notionally now the leader of the free world. But the one thing above all that we have to get, it's quite clear, as Alan says, that Ukraine is going to have to give up some things. But the one thing I would hold as tightly as possible is that in acknowledging the reality of a de facto Russian occupation of Ukraine, that nothing is agreed that legitimizes that to turn it into the de jure legal recognition of that land grab. Because if we're in a position where, in the world, where might makes right, and countries can invade each other and grab land like that, grab territory, grab people, grab resources, we're creating a very, very dangerous few years ahead for us. So even if there has to be the unpalatable pill swallowed that Russia will hold on to what it has taken, in no way should that be recognised legally. And that will be something that has to be resolved in some way in the future. But I think giving in, that would be the greatest victory Putin could get, and above all else, he must not get that.
So I'll just stick with you. Still on the impact, on Europe. Do you think like a Trump-style ceasefire? Do you think that would be a positive thing for Europe? I guess. Do you think if it actually goes through and there is a ceasefire and Russia managed to take sections of Ukraine, but the fighting stops, do you think that would make Europe safer, or do you think that would put Europe in more danger from Russia?
I think it just puts a pause on where things might go next. Look, is no fighting better than fighting? Well, objectively, yes. But the next thing is, where does Putin go next? He is in a precarious position domestically. He's already put down one uprising, but there's only so many political dissidents and rivals that he can crash their aeroplanes or throw them out of top floor windows. He's an old man, he's losing his grip on power to a certain extent, and these things can unravel very quickly. So what does he do next when he needs to have that external threat to shore up his position at home? Well, the obvious worry would be where he stands then on issues round about Kaliningrad. The Baltics took a big step towards further independence this week when they unhooked from the Belarusian and Russian electricity grid. So we have to be worried that countries which are actually in NATO might in some way next come under threat from Russia. And I'm not talking necessarily about a direct military threat, but there's a ramping up of the cyber attacks, of disinformation, of misinformation, of trying to politicise and activate the Russian ethnic populations that live in the Baltic states, for example, to manufacture some kind of crisis round about that. We have to be ready to make sure that Ukraine is not in NATO. Obviously, I don't think it ever will be in the foreseeable future, but there are countries which border Russia which are in NATO, including now Finland and Sweden. And while I think Finland and Sweden would be off the menu for any overtly aggressive action, if Putin thought there was some advantage to him, he might seek to test or resolve again in countries which are actually in NATO, and that requires a response of a different order of magnitude and firmness than we've managed so far with Ukraine.
So, like in the context of America basically demanding that Europe increases its defense spending substantially, do you think it actually realistic that Russia would like invade a NATO member if it managed to get some like territories in eastern Ukraine? Because that has been suggested quite a lot by like various politicians that that's a real threat. Like, do you see that as like a realistic threat, or do you see that as more of like I guess fear mongering in order to increase military spending?
No, I don't see it as fear mongering, although I
See,
do
it's
think it
realistic.
is. I don't think it's fear mongering, although I don't think it's necessarily realistic. But again, it would depend on what Putin thought he needed to do or could perhaps be let away with. But nevertheless, many European countries have been spending below the 2% of GDP level that all members of NATO are supposed to be committed to. So, in terms of NATO members taking greater responsibility for their own defence, I think that's an entirely reasonable thing. It would be a wise thing to do, given, as I say, that we have a less reliable president in the White House than we even had compared with Trump version 1.0. So, no, I don't think it's scaremongering. I think it would be a necessary thing to do on our own terms. But also, I mean, I was a member of the all-party parliamentary group on Estonia, and a couple of years ago, I travelled to Estonia. I met their Foreign Affairs Committee, their Defence Committee. Hugely impressive people who were on these bodies in the Estonian Parliament, and their biggest worry was Europe's lack of stocks of ammunition. You know, they were certain about our intellectual commitment to NATO and their territorial integrity, but the question was about whether or not, in the face of a really determined act of Russian aggression, what could we do to back up words with deeds? We're very short of ammunition stocks. In terms of the UK's own defence posture, we're spending far too much, in my opinion, on stuff like Trident that is not what is going to be. That's not the deterrent to aggression, no matter what people try and tell you. You know, we're not quite at the Cold War situation of two great powers facing off each other down the middle of a divided Germany again. That's not where we are. But
Yeah.
in terms of having the military force and flex that can be deployed in order to deter and, if necessary, defend, that's expenditure that's in completely the wrong area. And we need to rapidly reappraise, NATO as a whole needs to rapidly reappraise what its function now is, having found one again, arguably, and work out how it can best configure its economic, social, cultural strength in order to enable us to continue to live our lives and choose our governments in the manner that we would wish to be able to do so without external interference, which is the biggest threat coming from the Kremlin right now.
Is there not a risk though that like rearmament of the West could have the sort of adverse effect, like in the lead up to World War One, where countries had arms races and that did not add to like the security of the collective Europe. In fact, made stuff a lot more dangerous. Do you not think that could be a potential fear of raising military budgets?
No, frankly. There's going to be, Russia is already on a war footing. It has a war economy, even though it's struggling to produce what it needs, even to sustain what it has, in inverted commas, achieved in Ukraine. No, you have to be able to back words with deeds. And in terms of making sure that we're able to be effective allies within NATO and that NATO countries are able to ensure that they can defend their own borders and the borders of those that they've upheld to protect, then they need to be able to have the means of doing that. Nobody's looking at an arms race, but nevertheless, words have to be matched with deeds. And it's not good enough to grip the right lapel of your suit in the House of Commons and intone with sonorous gravitas or an attempt at it about betrayal and trying to sound like Churchill in the 1940 debate on Norway. You have to back those words with deeds, and so the sooner we realise that we're no longer the peace dividend that we enjoyed for 20 years after the end of the Cold War, that's over, and life just got tougher. And if we want to be able to uphold our democratic systems of government and prevent any further encroachment, that's what we need to be able to put on the table.
So just go to you, Alan. What are your thoughts on all of that in Europe, the impact in Europe, and what Europe should do?
Well, I agree with almost all of what Richard said, but as a nuclear physicist who lived and was active in nuclear physics and civil protection work during the Cold War of 1992, and somebody who's often had to answer to Ukrainians for what they consider was the betrayal through the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine gave up in the end the nuclear weapons that were held on their soil. Lots of debates about that and what was the control mechanism, who was driving them. It's a very complex issue, that. I think we're all aware, and there will be, that the nuclear weapon has been part rhetoric, both of Mr. Putin and buddy lapdog manager of the lands of Belarus for him, Mr. Lukashenko. I mean, whether or not, I'm still not entirely convinced there are nuclear weapons back in Belarus. It's all part of the noise and saber rattling. So we might not get, and we might not like the expense with things like Trident, but it's absolutely still a contemporary reality. These things are being used, albeit if it's also threats. But you can't threaten to use them unless you've. Mr. Putin certainly has them in great volumes. I think we also touched. There was a brief comment about the Kaliningrad situation and the fact that things are going to be a little bit more different of these territories. We have actually we've got a hostage there in the form of the lands of Kaliningrad. So if we sort of up the negotiating stakes in a Trump way, we might well be saying, okay, we will make life easy for you and okay in Kaliningrad, but you've got to make life easy and okay for some of the Ukrainian, or all of the Ukrainian territories. So there's a tough negotiation. We do, and I'd also like to, I haven't had much talk about it, but take up, and by the way, I heard another commentator today, a statement that it takes wars for Americans to learn geography. Well, it's about time that we learned the geography of where Belarus was, where Kaliningrad was, and the fact there's a bit of Lithuanian Poland. That is very potential dangerous trigger point. Well, if we were this one, what could be next? If we leave Mr. Putin still in control of his data, got a manager there, Mr. Lukashenko. He might try to call himself president, been into by in any legitimate way. Is essentially Mr. Putin's land manager for land that runs all the Polish border and the border. There is a huge threat there. Mr. Putin is not using his weapons in Ukraine anymore. We're going to see tension. And my prediction would be, and I might try to say I'm very optimistic. I'm optimistic that people will see sense in this and realize the thing you're going to do is let them roll up to the borders of Poland saying, well, I'm going to open up a corridor to Kaliningrad. You have a problem. So lot of clear issues of a European dimension, and I hope there are people in the State Department that are getting their maps of Europe out and scratching their heads over scenarios of what will happen if Mr. Putin gets a soft deal, Mr. Trump. Okay.
If just before we end, like, is there not a worry that America becoming more involved in areas like the Baltic states could in fact escalate the situation there instead of prevent a war? For example, if America starts to, add more arms and stuff in those territories, is there not a chance it might antagonize Russia and might trigger a problem which doesn't exist rather than stop a war from happening?
Yeah, apologies for sort of laughing there. You gave me instantly my, and I'm sorry, I've got the grey hair. I'm old enough. I remember when I flew into Vilnius in 1994, 2 years after the Soviet Union ended, and Vilnius airport looked like a massive American air base. I'm not entirely sure how. The trouble with what Trump is, his arrival doesn't just unwrap decades of American engagement in Europe. The air base personnel, it's all there now. And we're actually, interestingly enough, not seeing any great declarations. We're closing this down, we're closing that down. I wouldn't think that's Mr. Trump stuff. You know, he's got a foothold, he's got his forces there. Sheshov, the air base there, rest of Poland, was extensively used for reinforcement of military and arms movements in support of Ukraine. A huge American airbase, not to mention all the stuff that was generated post-war in central Montreal. The extent very quickly in 92, America rolled out and has never left. So, you know, there's nothing to worry about. It's where we're now, not of any future management of America in. Now, what we are talking about is America in the NATO countries. So this is America still is a NATO partner. So they're a strong partner, and we all know about what they say about the spending, and that spending is represented as massive presence in Baltics and in Poland and right across Europe, Germany in particular. So no change there, and therefore I'm not in any way concerned. I just hope I'd be concerned if we heard the other way and they started to run down these bases and they really are walking out.
Well, I mean, we've got about 5 minutes over time, so I'll just stop it. I mean, we could talk for much longer in this, but I'll end it now so we don't go on for too long. So yeah, no, that's all I've got time for. So yeah, thanks Alan, and thanks Richard. But just before I go, I want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everybody who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We raised £20,000 from April to the end of 2024, 16,000 short of our £36,000 target. We had to borrow £12,000 to enable us to pay our bills and survive, but the pressure is still on and we need to find enough regular donors to give us financial security. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. We need more regular subscribers, but we also need to clear our debt as well. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford just £5 a month, please consider becoming a member, a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you, and thanks to our guests. Thanks Alan, thanks Richard. Goodbye.
Thank
and
you.
Sorry, there's a bit of a delay. Yeah, I hear you like a second after. Goodbye and thanks for watching.